observed that people who own private property do a better job of protecting that than we do with respect to publicly owned properties. That's why this whole idea of tragedy at the commons has been carried on through history, because we can see that example time after time in location after location. Ownership inspires stewardship. An example that I like to use with the people is the whole idea of rental cars. There aren't very many people who actually wash a rental car and wax it before they return it to the dealership. It's not their car. They take better care of their own car. On the other hand, the rental car company, as soon as you return it, the first thing they do is wash it and wax it, because it's their car and they know if they take care of it, it will provide them good service for a longer period of time. So we want to, free market environmentalism encourages ownership of private property and a good education and understanding of how to best care for that. The free market system provides great solutions. I served in state government for a time, and we just had a regular open door policy of people to come in with new technologies that they'd either heard about, they developed themselves, but they wanted to share this information with other people in the Commonwealth of Virginia so we could all have an improving quality and condition of our natural resources. We think that the whole idea of, again, ownership and developing new solutions would encourage us as a country to reduce the amount of land that's owned by the federal government and figure a way to return it either to the states or indeed in many instances to private ownership, so we have actually better care than the federal government and federal state is afforded in these days. The fourth principle is that management of natural resources should be conducted on a site and situation-specific basis. To me, this sounds like common sense. A lot of people think no, that natural resources should be managed at the national level with one-size-fits-all policy because it's easier to do it that way. Well, that's not the way the environment works. Environmental challenges exist on a site and situation-specific basis. Problems are created by people or through natural circumstances on a site and situation-specific basis, and that's the way solutions should be developed. This is particularly true with air and water quality, and again, evidence abounds in these particular areas. Air quality problems are created under different circumstances, and the results and the solutions need to be developed for those particular locations. Water quality is the same way. I do think the appropriate role for state government, for instance, is to help citizens of a state understand what the condition of the water quality is. And so we, during my time in office, increased the number of sites where we did measuring of the water quality so that the citizenry in those particular areas would know if they had a problem. When we did identify a problem, then we were able to go to the citizens to help understand what the cause of that was, and then they, as a community, would develop their own solutions. The fifth principle is that the learning curve is green. Throughout the period of time, we have seen that the more knowledge that people have, the more they have a developed economy, the more quickly they learn how to use less of a resource to accomplish the same goal. Examples of this, of course, are soda cans. It wasn't too many years ago before you would buy a can that was made out of steel. Then they moved to aluminum. Now there's so little aluminum used in this can, if it were empty, probably half of the people in this room could tear the can in two. Why is that the case? It's because the people who create aluminum cans have two goals: to use as little of the product as possible to create something that will hold the Coca-Cola and allow the can to be stacked. They aren't interested in using as much aluminum as possible. They're interested in using as little as possible. This is the case. There are lots of examples: timber, other metals, plastics, raw materials in general in this country. And in many instances, we see now that what used to be waste material has now become a raw material for a new technology that the free market system has encouraged to be developed. We know that with respect to the environment, wealthier is healthier. As people become wealthier, they have a higher goal and a higher standard for the environment in which they live, work, and raise their family. They also have the means to solve challenges that come to pass, whether created by other people or, as I mentioned before, by other forces of nature. The sixth principle of free market environmentalism is that our efforts to reduce, control, remediate pollution should actually achieve real environmental benefits. Again, this sounds pretty logical, but you'll find that there are many people in the environmental community who aren't really interested in activities that really reduce the impacts on the environment. They're more interested in lawsuits, regulation, stopping people from engaging in activity. We think the focus needs to be on activities that actually do improve the quality and condition of the environment. That's one reason why we argue for the whole idea of federalism, because when you're working at the state level on environmental policy, you're very much more in touch with the people and the communities and the elected leaders of communities, because they all want to live and work in places where the environment is improving or in good condition. The seventh principle is that science should be employed as a tool to guide public policy. Too often we find these days that science is not employed as a tool to guide environmental policy, unless you're talking about computer science. But we're talking about real science here. We're talking about real science being used as a tool to guide public policy in the area of environmental policy. We have many, many good scientists, but we have many people in government now who have just kind of turned their authority over to computer sciences to come up with regimes and ideas and arguments that they want to make their case without having the benefit of having real scientists out working in the field. The final one that I'll mention is that environmental policies which emanate from liberty are the most successful. The most polluted spots in the world today are in what used to be the old Soviet Union. This is the country where the government, the central government, said pollution was against the law. They issued the permits, they did the inspections, and they were in control of the economy. Here in the United States, we might have our challenges and our problems with the way things are done, but we have a pretty transparent society. So we find environmental problems sooner, and we come up with solutions to fix them, because again, the American people, as a wealthier country, want to live in a place where the environment is improving always. Let me wrap up my comments by saying the key, we think, to free market environmentalism is to develop a set of principles, to understand what they mean and how they're applied, and then to live guided by principles instead of emotion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I find myself with very little disagreement with anything that Becky said, because her principles were expressed at such a high level of generality that really anything that might, our differences probably lie in the subtext, not the text. And I'm going to talk a little about subtext. I'm going to make 2 points about free market environmentalism. The first is we need government standards. Individual liberty is fine, it should play a role, but it's not sufficient. The second is environmental laws create markets that otherwise would not exist, and without them we don't solve environmental problems. This is a function of basic economics. Private owners have little incentive to reduce pollution harming the general public. And she focused on land, so I'll add that stewardship used to be a fairly common practice in natural resources companies. It's come under fire because of the tradition of corporate mergers, where if you hold land as an asset and try to conserve, you can be taken over by people who are ready to liquidate. So it's been, I think there is something to stewardship, but federal land protection has been pretty successful in realizing values that will never be realized through private ownership. We had an era of free market environmentalism where we relied heavily on state law and private initiative, and the results were disastrous. An example would be the North smog of 1948. This is an era when we rely on private companies to protect us, and to a very limited extent, almost no statutory law. The Norris Mod killed 20 people in a few days in a small town and made a half to a third of the residents ill. The Cuyahoga River caught on fire in 1969, which is a major impetus for the Clean Water Act. This particular picture is actually from an earlier fire in 1952. That's how polluted it was. The George Washington Bridge looked like this in 1972 after the Clean Air Act was passed but not yet implemented. And I remember this is kind of vivid to me because I used to drive through our city on an annual basis, and we had to turn down the windows because otherwise your eyes would smart and stink would be overwhelming, and that's not the case anymore. Thanks largely to a framework of federal environmental law. It does have a role for states, but insists on strives to meet health-based air quality standards. This is the accomplishments we've had since 1970 when the Clean Air Act has passed. Particulate matter has dropped 83%. This is a pollutant associated with tens of thousands of animal deaths. Sulfur dioxide associated with acid rain, down 74%. Carbon monoxide, potent neurotoxin from automobile emissions, down 74%. These last two pollutants are precursors of ozone, which has recently been discovered to have a role in causing premature death, but it's always been known to be a serious lung irritant and causing many respiratory ailments. Likewise, reductions there. Now, the other way of looking at this is not emissions, but ambient air quality, which is a product of emissions plus atmospheric chemistry and climate. And then you see sulfur dioxide down 54%, particulate 22%, carbon monoxide 65%, and so on. Ozone's been tough. We got 10% in 1983 to 2002. Since then, we got another 10%. When we got really stringent and really took some liberty away, we said, automobile manufacturers, no lead. We'll phase it out. 94% reduction in neurotoxin. Now, it seems to me that's the advantage of a capitalist system where you can take a pollutant that's undesirable, you can ban it, and leave them otherwise free to do whatever they want in producing fuel, but put some restraints on it. So there's a lot of room to do what you want. And the state is not determining the allocation of resources, but they are saying certain kinds of things are off limits, as opposed to the Soviet system where the big companies in the state are one. That is a very good or bad system. There is a role for the markets in environmental protection. In fact, what environmental standards do is they create markets in environmental protection, otherwise they do not exist. This is true of all environmental standards, regardless of the form. But even if the standard says you shall use this device, which is actually uncommon, but we do this occasionally when we can't monitor pollutants. Even in that case, the people who make devices like that are going to compete to offer the lowest price and the best design, and some polluters are going to get out of it and prevent pollutions that don't bother with the device. But a technique that's used quite a bit these days is emissions trading. And what emissions trading does is it says, we're going to set a standard like we always have, but we're going to say if it's really costly for you to meet that standard, it's okay not to, as long as you pay someone else to make extra reductions in your stead. And that is a very cost-effective approach, because what happens is the polluters rearrange their obligations to get the least cost way of meeting government set goals. And we know that the well-designed program can achieve environmental goals. That's what we learned from the acid rain program. The problem is that free market enthusiasm and an overly optimistic view of markets has often led to poor design. A big mistake we made prior to 1990 was we applied it to poorly monitored pollutants. In the acid rain program, when we required continuous emissions monitors, and we applied to pollutant that could be monitored, we had great success. That same mistake has been replicated in some portions of the greenhouse gas regime, where instead of confining it to carbon dioxide, which we could estimate reliably, we're complying it to other activities where we can't really come up with quantities very well. And that's a big problem because what the free market does, the incentives it creates, is for people to exaggerate the credits when they're earning credits and downplay the debits when they're not controlling. That's what the free market leads to. So you have to have designs that counter that. Offsets is another problem. The successful programs have put mass-based caps on the emissions of pollution sources and the people supply credits. Unfortunately, programs where there are no mass-based caps for people generating credits are subject to all kinds of fraud and chicanery. It's very important that we have political support for government to set robust goals in order to have an effective cap on emissions. And that's been a problem because sometimes in this overwhelming enthusiasm for markets, we get weak caps. That's been the problem with the first phase of the European Emissions Trading Program for Climate Disruption. There was a problem with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here in the Northeast. Another opportunity here to use markets in a way is to auction off the emissions, the allowances. We did that in the REGI program, and even though the caps were too slight, the auction revenue funded a lot of energy efficiency improvements that the private sector, even though they pay for themselves, have not found on their own, or couldn't realize on their own, as might be among individual homeowners who don't have the knowledge. So we were able to use that revenue to do outreach, to do measures, and to get more energy efficiency. Unfortunately, there's a tendency to give in to special interests, to not auction allowances, but to pass them out for administrative mechanisms. That leads to a lot of litigation and complication. So that's been difficult. So, by way of conclusions, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and very much to say about what Becky said, but we need government standards. They're essential to environmental progress. I don't think federal ownership will protect values of wilderness and recreation that are not likely to be very well supported through private stewardships. That said, well-designed market mechanisms can, in some cases, allow more cost-effective achievement of government-set standards. So I do think there's a role for private action in environmental protection, but efficiency by itself doesn't cut it, because there are lots of things we need to do that do not save materials. And also there's a failure of private parties to do the things that save materials surprisingly often, owing to a lack of expertise and other problems.
Well, let me just say very briefly here that part of the reason I think it is important to have a set of principles that guide you is because it actually encourages you to go back and actually do some research on some of the circumstances that occurred in the past. I would dare say that actually none of us in this room were alive or were active in the public policy debate when the first Clean Air Act was passed in the United States of America. But I would challenge you, if you're really interested in this, to go back and look and find out if the federal government followed or if the federal government led. And I believe that you will find that the federal government followed what was going on in states and in localities to deal with air quality issues. This is usually what happens. And it's very difficult to speak to a group of young people like this and to make arguments to you that you're going to have to go back and look up yourself and prove to yourself what the facts were. Now let me just say a little bit about Cuyahoga River. I grew up in Ohio. The problem with the Cuyahoga River is what I referred to earlier. It was called the tragedy of the commons. No one owned the Cuyahoga River. The government owned the Cuyahoga River. So, nobody had responsibility for it. Nobody took stewardship of the Cuyahoga River. Yes, it became a very famous case. But the government was the entity that was permitting people to dump into the Cuyahoga River. And when the government says you can do something, you assume that that's good for you. And I'm here to say, don't make that assumption. I think that it's fine if the government, if the federal government, if the national government wants to talk about science-based standards for what is good air quality and good water quality. But I think it should then be left to the states to make determinations with their own scientific community, both the state employees and the private sector in those states, about what standards they want in those states. I also think it's the responsibility of government, as I mentioned earlier, to protect people's rights. When we talk about some of the, when my colleague talked about some of the pollution issues, well, there was trespass, there was damage being done to individuals, and that should be something that is attacked at the root. That is the appropriate time for lawsuits. A one-size-fits-all federal regulation does not do a good job at improving our environment. It does do a good job forcing businesses all over the country to spend a lot of money, some of which, yes, falls on fertile ground, i.e. it solves the problem. Much of which is wasted solving a problem which doesn't exist for a particular company. So I think it's very important, if you're interested in environmental policy, that you actually go back and look at the circumstances that we've dealt with in our country, and you can determine in your own mind, were the people at the center of this issue? Were people trying to solve the problem? Who set the standard by which the people, the companies were operating at the time? Who was allowing what to occur? Were the people protected in all of this? How did private property play a role? I can tell you that the federal estate now is suffering from the tragedy of the commons. And private ownership in this country, and there's example after example here in New York, all across the country, of where private ownership has done a much better job for the land, for the soil, for the habitat. So you need to keep in mind, as young people who are just moving into a world where you're going to be the responsible parties, to actually go back and look at the facts of the circumstances, identify some principles by which you can guide your life, but make sure that you're making decisions based on history that you've actually researched and you understand, and not just a perspective that someone is sharing with you. Thanks.
Let me just start with a one-size-fits-all idea. I think the extent to which federal environmental regulations one-size-fits-all is exaggerated. That is, the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, for example, have different standards depending on how dirty the air is in terms of what you must do. Some specifics are put in there. Water quality standards on the Clean Water Act are set by the states, subject to some federal oversight, but the primary decision maker in that is the states. That said, the primary example of one-size-fits-all, although even that's a little exaggerated, are best available technology standards on the Clean Water Act. They've been fabulously successful. And they allow economies of scale that are unavailable to state governments and private governments that save a lot of money. And it's just not the case that every individual landowner can come up with the right approach. That's ridiculous. Industry doesn't operate like that. When it has any knowledge, it's sharing through trade associations. And there's a lot that industry doesn't know that environmental specialists and EPA can help with. And there's a reluctance to adopt best practices because they sometimes cost money. With respect to the history, I think there's something what Becky's saying. Now, California was a leader, and I think you can make a case that a lot of the history of environmental laws, the federal government catching up with California. With respect to most other states, it's the opposite. It's the federal government keep trying to get the states to do the minimum. And it's amazing how consistent this is over time. If you read these old Supreme Court cases, some of the states that are urging cleanup and the ones that are resisting it, the same ones you see in battles on the Clean Air Act. From the 1920s to what you see in the Clean Air Act. But the overall picture is the one shown by this slide. In the 1960s, when we had very little federal law, and we were looking for states for leadership, there were very few states that had any pollution control programs. There were few. The result was a 40% increase in sulfur dioxide. You got the Clean Air Act Amendment, 74% decrease. In particular, there happened to be some decreases, having very little to the state efforts. It had to do with a shift toward natural gas in homes and in industrial uses. You did get some reductions without much government impetus at all, actually. But it was only 16%. In subsequent years, when we applied a regulatory structure with strong federal law, 83%. Nitrogen oxides, 48%. 55% reductions from 1970 to 2011. Volatile organic compounds, 27% increase in this period, 65% reductions afterwards. Carbon monoxide, 18% increase, 74% decrease under the Clean Air Act. Now, that said, I'm not saying there are no areas where private actors sometimes do good things. I'm not sure Coke cans is one of them. Part of the law that helped support that movement was requirements that you have to take back cans and recycle them. That gives you a pretty big incentive to cut down on waste. In Germany, they've gone further and said you take back the packaging. There are disconnects within markets. They occur all the time. A good example is rental housing, right? If you rent a house to a student, and the student's paying the heating bill, it may not be your interest to add insulation. It would be cost effective in the long run. It would also help reduce emissions from the power plant. So it's a complicated subject. I wouldn't go so far as saying, no, there's never a good role for private stewardship, never an area where you can rely on a private landowner to do the right thing, to help them to do the right thing, the right information. But there are big disconnects in markets, there are huge information shortages, there are big problems, and for that reason they've never been successful without some kind of good regulatory framework. And that's how wealth has been translated into environmental progress. It's not some magical process where because we get wealthy, we spontaneously improve our environmental performance. It's that as we get wealthy, we demand that our governments set standards, and that's how every advanced country has made significant environmental progress.
Okay, so I guess I get the last formal word here. Let me just say quickly, thank you all for coming and for your interest in this topic. I think if you think about this going forward, I would just encourage you to think about, first of all, people. Are people involved in the equation for improving quality and condition of the environment? If we don't have them involved, they aren't going to have the knowledge or the understanding or the willingness to look at improving the quality and condition of the environment around them. They are the most important aspect of environmental quality. Science. Is science involved in making the determination both about what is pollution and is harmful, what level is harmful, and what is the science behind solving the problem? We know that using good science, we can improve our environment and quality and condition, and that's an important lesson that we need to keep in mind. Stewardship. Ownership does inspire stewardship, and there are examples of this all around your community here at Cornell and all around the country. We need to learn those lessons and help share those lessons with others. Economic growth is important. Economic growth leads to new technologies, it leads to a wealthier, healthier citizenry, and as a result, the demand for always improving the environment will be there. Finally, solutions to environmental problems can best be developed in an atmosphere of liberty. And the bottom line for all of this, from my perspective, is we want free markets, and we want free people to have those free markets so we can have a better life for all. Thanks very much. We look forward to your questions.
with the likes of India and China that are growing at economic rates that are outpacing America by a lot, when we're imposing these types of government acts on ourselves and losing our competitiveness, what kind of solutions do we think going forward? How do we remain competitive with India and China and maintain our status as the world's?
Well, the primary source of competitiveness disadvantages is wage differentials. It's not environmental protection. Environmental protection is a tiny percentage of manufacturing costs, on average less than 1%. So it's mostly about wages. And so the problem is low-cost wages in China competing with us. And I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I think the main thing that we have to do is we have to take advantage of the fact that we are an advanced society and beef up our educational system so that we have the skills that we can compete with China without harming our standard of living as much as we have already. Because what's been happening because of that and because of vast inequalities in our country is that the middle class and the poor have stood still economically or declined, depending on what statistics you look like, for 30 years. That's what's been happening in the era of free market generation. And it's not going to get reversed unless we make big infrastructure investments and big investments in education, if then. It's a difficult problem.
Let me just say very quickly that India and China are aspiring to be what America is. And they're going through a lot of the growing pains that third world countries go through. They're just the biggest, and they're growing much more quickly. But lots of other countries in the world are having similar challenges because people want a better lifestyle. They want something better for themselves and their families. I think that it's going to be difficult to compete successfully with India unless the United States of America actually takes a look at some of the challenges that we're placing on our market system, some of the limitations that we're placing, given what's going on in the rest of the world. Heritage does produce an index of economic freedom, which is a great source of information that actually you can look at 10 key elements of economic freedom and look and see what's going on in each country of the world. We've done this for over 15 years now, so you can see where these countries are making a difference. China today, of course, has some really serious pollution problems. But what we're finding is, as the Chinese people get wealthier, they're actually telling their government, their national government and their city governments, hey, we need to do something about this. And when people get to the point where they have jobs, they have security of their jobs to the extent one can have that, then they want to see improvement in the quality and condition of the environment around them. So it will continue to be a challenge. We do throw up a lot of roadblocks to our market system, but maybe we'll learn some lessons. Thanks for your question.
So I have a question for Becky. You talked about stewardship in the Cuyahoga River. I'm wondering how you would apply that model to something like the Mississippi River, to something like where you have, competing state claims, or something like, say, the Pacific Ocean, which is outside of the, territorial jurisdiction of the United States, or doesn't belong to any state in particular.
Well, of course, there are challenges, and we were commenting earlier, talking earlier, and I said, the problem free market environmentalists have is we never really had a free market environmental policy, and we're starting from a place in history now where it's, going to be a challenge for us to move back in that direction. Water quality is a challenge, but you can come up with agreements. In Virginia, for instance, we developed agreements between counties and had this system in place of actually being able to monitor water quality, and we would put monitors right around county lines, so that we, the state government, we didn't want to impose mandates, but what we wanted to do is then bring people together when we identified a problem so that they could work together to come up with a solution that would work for their citizens. This can be done on the Mississippi. So many of the problems that we have with the Mississippi River are a direct result of federal government policies or other government policies that have encouraged activities that are damaging to the river. With respect to the oceans, of course, the United States controls out to the 200-mile limit. We can do something about the management there. And in the international community, of course, there are many treaties that are in place now. The question is, are they working? Are they satisfactory? Do they use market mechanisms that will allow us to actually assign property rights for certain things like fisheries or certain aspects? You're not giving a title, but you're assigning the concept of property rights, so that people would be encouraged to care for their part of the ocean or river.
Professor Driesen, you talked about government standards, and you kind of made it sound good. In fact, at the end, it was like, yeah, we need government standards.
Right.
But then after looking at it, kind of realizing that it's not really government standards, it's more, it seems to me, government micromanaging every little detail of how a business should operate. So how do we deal with this problem? How do we get away from, I guess, general standards as opposed to having the EPA delineate rules, which seem to micromanage organizations, which then just cost thousands, if not millions of dollars in litigation expenses and years before these regulations take place?
Well, in the environmental area, the standards I'm talking about are mostly numerical limits for how much pollution you can discharge. Not all in that form. Some of them are tradable allowances, some of them are more specific technology mandates. I don't think that you're going to get away from litigation, unfortunately, if the government protects the environment, because protecting the environment costs money. It doesn't usually help the bottom line. Now, there are exceptions to that. Energy efficiency is an area where the problem is the lack of process engineering capacity in companies. And the government, with an informational program, a lot of cooperation, and if we're going to fund government adequately, they can go out and do outreach and actually get some of that going. But it isn't the case, and I think this has to do with the culture of the United States, rather than from having a terribly intrusive regulation. Because in Europe, where they have standards that are at least as strict, you don't have this traditional litigation. It's an adversarial nature of business. And I guess I go on and say I don't agree that we control every aspect of business decision making. I mean, this business of analogizing command and control regulation to Soviet stuff is crazy. We don't determine how much people produce. We don't determine what they produce by and large. We don't determine what they pay their workers. We don't determine where they locate their facilities, except to a few constraints. And an example of this, to take another area of regulation, is financial regulation. The reason we had a financial crisis is we repealed a regulatory framework that kept us safe from the Great Depression through the 1970s. And that framework separated investment and commercial banking. It said it made speculative derivatives trading illegal because it was illegal in common law for 200 years. And it repealed all that and said anything goes. Now, even when those standards in place, banks have a lot of control within their spheres about what mix of activities they would do, a lot of control over what they paid, a lot of control over what products they made. But there was a framework that was designed to keep us all safe. When we took that framework apart, they went crazy and created a financial crisis. And that's what we're doing with the environment now, by the way. We're threatening the framework by trying to shift the responsibility for the job losses from finance companies and the financial regulators to environmental regulation so that we can stop us from addressing the next environmental crisis, which is climate disruption.
If I could just comment on that, I think that we do have some serious challenges in this regard. Automobile emissions, for example. I was the State Secretary of Natural Resources for 4 years in the late 1990s. From the day I got into office until the day I left office, our team in Virginia asked EPA, how do you set automobile emission standards? They refused to tell us. It was based on computer output. We said, well, what was the computer input? Help us to understand this. No, they would not tell us any of that information. they were applying an air quality standard in Virginia to 3 sections of the state. Northern Virginia, primarily automobiles, very little manufacturing. Tidewater, Virginia, where there was a little bit more manufacturing, and Southwest Virginia, where there was mountains. And yet it was, they're making this assignment. You've got pollution problems, fix them. And they were telling us how to fix them. Now, not down to the minutest detail, but in much more detail than Virginia would prefer. It is a challenge. When you don't know what the inputs are, and all you're getting is the outputs, and then you're told essentially how to fix it. That is a real problem, in my judgment, for the federal government, and it really is very restrictive on states and localities about how to fix the problem. Now, we are actually giving more mandates from the federal government these days. I mean, recently there was actually an NLRB decision about a company not being able to relocate. That's pretty intrusive by the federal government. I think the question really needs to get back to, if you're going to talk about standards, the federal government can talk about what a good air quality standard is, and then states can say, in our state, we're going to set these standards, and the federal government should have nothing more to say about it. Government should be responsible for protecting people. That's why I say people are our most valuable and precious resource. If a company is polluting and harming people, then the state and local government should be able to have action in this regard. But right now, our federal government is getting much more intrusive in terms of telling governments where they can operate, how much they can pay their employees, what the standards are, and as you know, we now own a couple of companies. The federal government now owns a couple of companies. Yeah.
I have a question for you, actually. You were talking about how by giving private ownership, we can encourage people to look after environmental factors, and how if their bottom line says it's a good idea to take environmental conservation steps, that they'll do it. But I'm wondering how we address some of the time value of money problems, where we have, if I can save $1 billion over the next 20 years by spending $700,000 today, it might not be worth it because the present value of the savings won't be worth the $700,000. I'm wondering how free market environmentalism can resolve that problem.
Well, I think one of the challenges that we really have in the corporate area is that the federal regulators of corporations and their finances forces corporate officials to focus on the next quarter as opposed to the future of the company. This is very bad. It's bad for the environment. This is the federal government. Thank you very much. So, I think there are lots of areas where people who are concerned about the environment and the role that corporations play need to actually begin peeling back the layers of the onion and see, well, what is causing this? Is this just bad people who want to pollute the atmosphere and they're just going to go out and do it, come hell or high water? Or are they being induced to do this by some federal law or regulation? So I think that we do have some real challenges in this area.
I don't know of any federal law or regulation that forces companies to focus on the next quarter. The primary impetus for doing that has been Wall Street culture and the stock market, and a lack of any regulation limiting hostile takeovers, which was a huge amount of pressure on corporate managers to think short term. This is not a product of government regulation. It's a product of market structures, that short-term focus. And the discount rate is a big problem. And instead of the federal government saying, one of our purposes is to get out of myopia that sometimes causes private actors to do short-sighted things, has institutionalized myopia by putting high discount rates in the cost-benefit analysis.
Well, obviously we have a significant disagreement in this area. I would just say, I don't think there's any company in America too big to fail. I wouldn't be owning a car company if it were up to me at the federal level. I think that Wall Street does do things that are wrong, and I think a lot of what they're doing is induced by the federal government, federal policies. So I guess what I would say is, since you can see that we have a clear disagreement here, look for yourself. Look and see if there are actually federal laws and regulations. What's the SEC doing and the whole other litany of alphabet soup guiding our financial area? Are they engaged in activities and forcing corporations to do things that are unwise for the long term, but will be prudent in the short term?
So this is for Becky. You're calling this free market environmentalism, but correct me if I'm wrong. From what I'm hearing, it actually sounds like you're saying that you think it should be more state regulations rather than federal regulations. Is that accurate?
No, I wouldn't say that was accurate, but it is certainly true that I think the federal role should be more limited and more authority for things should be turned to the states. But I do think that if you have states more involved in the environmental area, they will look to the marketplace for more solutions.
Okay, because I guess the free market that I'm seeing is where you're talking about ownership as stewardship. And I guess this kind of goes back to what Adam and Sergio and Chad were talking about. But with the Cuyahoga River, if I owned the river and companies were paying me to be able to dump things in it, I might think that that's more worthwhile than to be a steward. But the problem, and under a free market system, I don't know that there's much, without the government telling me otherwise, I'm not sure there's much we can do about it. Whereas if the government owns the river and the citizens think there's a problem, you can at least petition the government to set standards, to make the companies behave, to forbid, to stop the companies from dumping it in the river. You're saying that the problem is that no one owned it, but I think the problem is that the people who owned it weren't really paying attention to it.
No, the government actually had control over the river.
Right.
What you find is that when people own water bodies, sections of river, as they have done in England, for instance, where you give authority to even a local government here, because we can't give the water quality, we can't give the water to private citizens. People actually have when people have ownership and responsibility, they actually have an incentive to keep the quality of the river flowing through their community good. I mean, we found that in Virginia because we worked with the localities on what we call the tributary strategy, and we didn't want to mandate what they were going to do, but we went to them and said, we have an interest in having the James River be cleaner, but you have more of an interest because look how it benefits your community. And the local people and the local officials, because again, it's a river, kind of took ownership of it. Now, in places where people do have ownership of sections of river, they usually do it for a particular reason, and they monitor from the point their ownership starts to when it ends, and if there's any smidgen of pollution that comes into it, I mean, believe you me, they're on it right away. People want clean rivers. And whether it's controlled by a local government or a state government or by an individual family, they're not looking for how can we make the most money to pollute our river. They recognize that the value of a free-flowing, clean river is very high.
Right. So you were saying that the river that the river that went on fire, that was a tragedy of the common situation. Right. But the government owned the river; they just weren't taking an interest in it. The people either were not being persuasive enough to their legislators, or I don't know the exact situation. Maybe the city was making money off of them dumping into it. I don't know that a free market system is going to change that. Whereas at least with a government involved, not necessarily the federal government, but a city government, people can, the citizens of the city can go to their legislators and say this is.
Well, I mean, what you're saying, of course, is true that people can go. The Cuyahoga River was controlled by state government. And state government and federal government permitted the pollution of this river. Now, we see the tragedy of the commons on many locations where the federal government owns land. where they, people come to them and say, we want to use this land. They say, okay, it's federal land. You should be able to use it. So there are challenges when government owns land. That means all of the people, quote unquote, have access to it. And the beauty of turning things back to a state, in my judgment, particularly with these water bodies, is people do have more immediate recourse to go to their state legislators or their mayors or their city councils or their county supervisors when they find a problem. And because it's in that community, these local officials have a greater sense to pay attention, first of all, to the electorate, but also to knowing that this river body is valuable to the community. They have more of an incentive to keep it in good shape.
This is often stereotype conversation because, I live in Syracuse. We have the most polluted lake in the country. It's the Onondaga Lake. It's got nothing to do with ownership. What happened is the local environmental organization sued the state, the city, and the county and said, we've got to clean this up, and they won. They had to enter into a consent decree. Under the consent decree, the city is deciding how it's going to do this. It's not the federal government, it's the city. It's got to meet federal standards, but it decides how. It's changed its mind. It started out with a plan of big, expensive treatment works, and it's moved to a more integrated approach. They're going to use cheaper solutions like rainwater collection and things to reduce the capacity of that sewage treatment plant. And you find that that's the way the majority of things work in environmental law in real life. It's not just federal to the exclusion of private individuals and states. It's some sort of mix, and the questions that raises are much more nuanced.
I do think that's true, but I think the problem is when you have such a big federal government and you always have this federal oversight. Sometimes the federal government is the one coming in saying they want this expensive fix, and then the state or the locality either has to accept that or fight back. So there are lots of challenges when you have the huge federal involvement. Yeah.
What do the empirics look like behind a free market environmental system? We're talking about huge swaths of land and large bodies of water. Surely there must be some series of benchmarks that we can use across the board to compare to sort of the decrease in particulate matter and pollutions that we've seen sort of stacked up by the federal government.
Well, I think, as I said, we haven't really had a free market environmental regime in this country. What we have seen, though, is the point that I made: wealthier is healthier. As our economy has grown and people have gotten wealthier, they have focused on things to improve the quality and condition of the environment. Yes, the federal government has been involved, but who's to say what the impetus is in every situation for the improvements? We know that in other parts of the world where they have people become wealthier, as soon as they become wealthier, and that's not wealthy but wealthier, they look for improving the quality and condition of the environment in their community, whether it's their home or their neighborhood.
I guess, this begs a number of questions, and I apologize to everybody for a quick follow-up, but how does this address then issues of environmental justice? Do we merely say that, if you live in a rich community, you get cleaner water, and everybody is poor, sort of SOL, or? Wealthier
is healthier doesn't mean rich. Everybody who becomes wealthier, the whole idea of our society, our country, is that people should be able to move from poverty and have a path to improving their lives, and that does happen. It is probably true that if you go to a very poor community, they're not so focused on improving the quality and condition of the environment in their community, but they certainly, when they own their own home, are focused on making sure that their home is in the best situation it can possibly be. And as they become wealthier, then they look for those continued improvements. A newer car that pollutes less.
As a person concerned about climate change, and I'm a Marylander, and our state actually sort of values pollution differently than Virginia does, which leads to some real conflicts. But we like our shoreline to remain extant for the next 100 years, and we're being impacted by we're already seeing larger storm surges that are causing significant erosion. And I'm wondering, you know, as a state that, as like the citizenry of our state wants to protect our shoreline, who do we sue, or what are our mechanisms for preventing this, what we see as this 100-year problem that we don't want to lose our like vibrant ocean tourism economy? So I'm just wondering in the framework what your solution is for us.
Well, I think the point that this gets at is in Becky's presentation seems to view this in terms of local stewardship. And this to me was an antiquated notion 40 years ago when air pollution, and that's the context she got operated in Virginia as an air pollution control official. The pollution then was a regional issue, 13 states impacting it. And it's not just a question of what environmental quality Virginia want, it's a question of what is Virginia going to do to make it possible for New Jersey to have the quality it wants. And climate change has this problem on a global scale. And you know, you talk about your community, and there are communities in Bangladesh that are going to be flooded out, millions of refugees, unless we take responsibility, not for ourselves, not for stewardship, for them. It's a matter of justice. And if we have this, so I think that's very important. In terms of the answer, I think, frankly, Maryland by itself has very little power to mitigate climate change. It has to become politically active to lobby the federal government to do this seriously. And I think when the federal government begins to move, we've already seen some movement in China and India's position, and there'll be more if the United States has a credible story to tell about it taking care of the problem. It had a big role in policing. What Maryland can do is adaptation, and that is very local stewardship. Is a good activity for local government. It's something that has to be local, needs to involve communities. You got to get people. I think the idea of command to solving adaptation is crazy. It really challenges liberal democracy because you're not going to get people to move themselves out of harm's way by commanding them. You're going to have to persuade them, and there may be need for public works. They're going to take public support. Emergency management plans, they're going to need the participation of local law enforcement. And so the place where there's some room for stewardship and local government playing big roles in adaptation, mitigation, well, there are things that states can do, and they're not trivial, is on a global scale. We really need the federal government to get going. And this image, this loyalty of completely unfettered free markets has been a real big impediment to that. We all agree that free markets need to operate so we can have a basic standard of living. Nobody wants to go to a Soviet system, but we need federal government to either tax pollution or set some kind of rules, maybe form tradable allowances to make serious progress on a problem like that.
I would just say there are two things that I'm aware of that people can do. One is actually get involved in some of the adaptation initiatives that are going on, not only in the United States, but around the world, because there are lots of things that can impact the shoreline besides your concern about global climate change. And we do need to be thinking about these things. I mean, that's just, and we can do that as private citizens working with others in association. The second thing I think that's really important in this country that's lacking is good science education. My guess is if you went back and looked at the state standards for science in your states, obviously they're ranked, 50 states, 50 different standards, you would find that the science education of our young people is woefully lacking. And I think one of the most important things that we can do to make sure that we're looking down the road at an improving environment in the future is to try and make certain that our young people, K through 12, K through 6, are actually getting a good science education so they know what real sound science is, how do you go out and engage in scientific activities. It helps you understand more of what we're dealing with in lots of different areas, water pollution, air quality, and so forth and so on. So that's a tangible thing that everybody can do now as just a citizen of the state.
So I have a brief follow-up, which is, I mean, in Maryland, we can't say this honestly, but I think we have excellent science education, and so we have an educated citizenry that really wants clean water and is really worried about climate change. So my question is, under your free market paradigm, what do we do next after we've educated ourselves?
Well, I I don't want to get in an argument with you over Maryland, but my guess is the science standards in Maryland aren't all that high. Some of the challenges that we've seen in Maryland, have to do with good farming practices and fishing practices, and how do you deal with your neighbors to the north, Delaware and New York, on actually, water quality issues there. I think that you have to make sure that you have those good science standards in place. But then beyond that, I think you have to work and build relationships with other states and other organizations that will work together with you on some of these challenges. I mean, Tocqueville talked about one of the beauties of our country was when you find a problem, you develop an association to come together and look for solutions. We've solved many problems in our country today because individuals and groups of individuals and sometimes states come together and say to the national government, we want to do things differently. Yes, I think, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I don't want to be run out of the room by the next professor. Yes?
So I guess my question would be, you were talking about in free market environmentalism, the tragedy of the commons, and you're suggesting that private ownership can solve that. And I understand with maybe a river where upstream somebody's dumping in the river, you have an action, a law against them. But how are you going to find, the 1,000 or so citizens that live around your river that are dumping gasoline in their backyard that's old, or dumping paint in their backyard that's old? There are things that are very small that you're not going to be able to go and find them and sue them, and because you're being harmed by that. The only reasonable way to deal with those types of situations seems to be some sort of regulation. And so, if your argument is that free market is the way to solve that, it seems to be, lacking.
Well, let me just say quickly, I'm not sitting up here arguing for no regulation and no standards. And I do think that it is important, and I think science education is very important to this. We found in Virginia, for instance, that lots of people were dumping things in the storm sewers because they didn't know any different. They didn't know that by dumping something in the storm sewer, it was going to impact the water quality in the James River or the Potomac River. And once we had an education program with the communities, and we used good science to help them understand this, people changed their behavior. People will change their behavior. Having said that, you have to have the science that says if you dump used oil into a storm drain, it's going to impact the water quality. So a lot of these things actually work together. And I think that in many instances we have to go back and make sure that we're doing the basics before we can come up with a regime at the top and say, well, this is the kind of a regulation that we need, or this is the kind of standard that we need to set, and who should set it. When we talk about free markets, we're looking for maximizing individual freedom and responsibility. And that means your freedom ends when you begin to harm someone else's.
Well, this is that's one of the reasons we have modern environmental law, is the idea of stopping the harm when it hurts somebody else. That could be done through common law, actually, when there are only a few industrial facilities in the country, because then when your crops were damaged, you pretty much knew who did it. Once you had a really serious problem with millions of automobiles and tens of thousands of facilities, causation became impossible to prove, and that system was inadequate. And that's why we created environmental standards. And I have to say, the idea of owning a river by private individuals it revokes a principle that goes back to Roman times, which was created as the foundation for commerce, that the rivers had to be owned by nobody so that there could be unobstructed commerce and no rent extraction, so that it's sort of like the internet. It's a little bit of the argument of keeping the internet free. To me, it's an important commons resource. That doesn't mean it has to be unregulated, but it seems to me the idea of privatizing sections of the river is prone to all kinds of chicanery.
Well, that won't happen in our country. Now, I will say there are portions of Virginia rivers that were granted to individuals by the king, and that has been maintained and upheld by law. So there are a few sections of Virginia rivers that are privately owned. But what I'm talking about here is the whole idea of applying the principles of ownership. I mean, this can occur if a river runs through a city or a county. The whole idea is to inculcate in American citizens good scientific standards, a good understanding, as well as the ability to work together in relationships to meet standards and allow free flow of commerce. It's kind of rethinking the regime that we have, and it really calls for people to think outside the box.
It seems like it doesn't seem like it's really answering the question, since if you're just saying we should have an ownership-like regime by saying the town owns it or the state owns it, what's the difference between that and saying the federal government owns it? At some point, at some level, you're still saying ownership.
Well,
at some level, you're just saying somebody who has, so if you say, the state owns it, and then the state can do things by passing laws.
That's right. I mean, that's right. I mean, I agree. It's not pure. I'm not talking about purity here. What I'm saying is that if you give the authority in states, and the states are willing to work with the localities, you're actually getting to the point where the citizens are more involved in maintaining the quality and condition and improving the quality and condition of the resource. We have rivers that flow through from other states into Virginia. Well, we have to work with those other states on quality and condition of the river because we don't have the authority to impose something on them. But nevertheless, you have a situation where we're actually working together for the good of the people of the two states for the quality of the river.
Yeah, I think what Becky's talking about is not thinking outside the box. She's describing the current clean water law because, in fact, many interstate water bodies are managed by compacts or agreements among states. The water quality standards are set by states. Some of the regulation, not all of it, is state. The big point source is regulated by the federal government. And nobody disagrees with the idea of taking good science into account, developing the best science we can, and having good science education. So to my mind, this doesn't all go together. That is, the idea of private ownership of a river is separable from good science and good science education. And those two ideas are really good. The idea of private ownership of a river isn't. The idea of having the communities need to be involved in many kinds of environmental decisions, I completely agree with. And that's been the way federal environmental law has been set up, including water quality standards, state transportation planning for air quality, a whole host of realms, primarily state matters or local matters.
Well, let me just say that one of the biggest problems that we have with water quality and condition in this country is called the Army Corps of Engineers. This is not a state-run authority. It's not local. It is not private. It is the federal government. And they contribute to the pollution and to the degradation of rivers all across this country, and they do it in the name of commerce. So I guess what I'm saying is, when you look at a situation like that, I mean, people who are for the feds in control, are they saying, well, that's okay because it's the federal government, they know best? No, I don't think so. I think we need to have a state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, have authority and responsibility for the rivers and the water quality in our state without the federal government being able to come in and make demands on us at any time. We in Virginia like having clean rivers and we like having commerce. And we think that we can do it with standards that meet the people's goals who live in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that right now is not the case. The federal government can poke its fingers in at any time, and the Army Corps of Engineers does a lot. Now, I'm not saying everything they do is bad. There are some things they do that people like. But many of the problems that we're dealing with in our rivers today are the direct result of the role of the Army Corps of Engineers.
A really good book on this question of state ownership and private ownership. They have a calls look at that. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the title, but it looks at European examples of state and private ownership to look at this free market environmentalism ideal. And I have to say, Becky's put sort of a presumption that the federal government doesn't have much of a role to play. And I'm not saying the federal government is always right. I'm just saying that you have to look at each policy. And in some cases, I'm talking about regulating big national industries with fairly common control techniques. There are huge economies of scale available at the federal government that you want to take advantage of. And there are other cases where a big federal role is appropriate. And I'm not saying the federalism mix we have now is perfect. But it is a mix, and it does have a role for local government, and I don't think it's, and all these governments change over time. You know, if the federal government gets totally taken over by corporations and the locals don't, then the local government's going to be a better source of environmental protection. So as I started out, California has been a leader in environmental protection. There are no general rules about these things. This has to be evaluated somewhat in terms of tendencies. You know, are there economies of scale available? Do you have a need for local knowledge with a particular problem? But some of this depends on the politics of the moment and what states and localities and federal governments are like, and they vary over time, and across countries, by the way.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Well, do we have a class up there? I think we do.
No, actually, that's going to be something different. We've got 3 rooms going on here. So there's some sort of architects meeting going on. We're kind of using the walls.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sir, thanks. Is there an objection?
Usually there's a way to...
Hey, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm gonna head off to the airport. Take
Okay.
care.
We have a keyboard off here. These all operate slightly different.
Well, I hope your standards in Maryland are higher than they used to be.
Our standard,
You know, when you go to Virginia in 1992,
I had to go to class, I just wanted to say hello somewhere.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I hope you come back to Cornell.
Oh, I hope so.
We'll try to get you back here.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thanks, Kurt. There's nothing left.
Well, I hope you do. Of course, county by county. Oh, yeah. But they do set